today was specifically around explaining our updated systems house scheme, and also to talk through the new EN classification scheme for Dorsets, which we developed in response to the regulatory changes that took place last September. But before we get moving with the presentation, I just wanted to take the opportunity to explain why we're doing this. Element is a testing, inspection and certification business that covers a number of brands well known to many of you, including BM TRADA, a Q-Mark certifier, as well as Warrington Fire in Birchwood and BM TRADA in High Wycombe. We offer fire safety expertise. We provide expert fire testing and certification service for a wide range of industries, including construction, aerospace and manufacturing. We have accredited testing facilities, and we operate state-of-the-art fire testing laboratories around the world, performing tests such as reaction to fire, fire resistance and smoke toxicity. We have global reach with multiple laboratories and offices across Europe, Asia and the Americas, and we serve clients worldwide. We offer independent third-party certification services, helping manufacturers and contractors meet safety and regulatory standards. And we also assist companies in complying with international fire safety regulations and standards. Now, we appreciate that the recent changes to the requirements around BS 476 being withdrawn from Approved Document B, as well as many of the other changes to the regulatory landscape in the industry, present challenges to your business. And our key objective is to support our clients and stakeholders. I hope you find this session useful, and thank you for attending. So what are we going to cover today in this presentation? I'm going to look at the EN classification process. Now, I know a few of you probably heard me give some presentations on this, but this particular one, I'm going to look in a bit more detail at the process of XAP, and also get a little bit more under this, the sort of, if you like, under the skin of the concept of product families, and really show you how that relates to what you're already familiar with the products that you manufacture under Q-Mark. We'll also look at the Q-Mark Systems House scheme and look at the objectives and requirements of this scheme. This is an existing scheme, but we have updated it to accommodate the EN 13501-2 classification system, and aiming to roll that out wider across the systems houses operating within the Q-Mark certification space. We'll also look at the Q-Mark scheme for Doorset Manufacturers, looking at the objectives and requirements, and specifically in relation to EN 13501-2 and the classification system. We'll also look at the requirements for supporting evidence within Q-Mark certification. And as you can see, as I've been clicking through those bullet points, we've produced TI sheets that relate to the systems house scheme, the Doorset scheme, and a specific TI sheet on supporting evidence and what we look for within our certification schemes. They will be made available. We'll add a link at the end of the presentation, and you'll be able to click through and find those documents. So a lot of what we're talking about today will be supported by these TI sheets that you'll be able to reference as well. So very quickly, and I'm sure we're well aware now as to why EN classification and why EN classification certification. But just to recap, we know that following the government announcement made in September 2024, that BS 476 will be replaced by EN standards by 2029 when it comes to fire resistance, including fire doors. And at the moment, that will be withdrawn from Approved Document B in England, and we wait to hear what other devolved governments will follow suit. Within the revised text to Approved Document B, if you look at the text that's being proposed for the 2029 version, the language in there, when you look at certain parts of Annex B, is that there is a requirement to specify EN classification wherever possible. So there is a drive, not just on EN standards, the supporting standards, the test standards, but actually the classification system itself It does acknowledge that where that's not possible, that there will be other routes through assessment, but we're to talk about EN classification today. So there was certainly a driver within that regulatory guidance for specifiers, contractors, and so on will start asking for EN classification, and certainly Dorsets can be EN classified, and we'll look in some detail at that as we go through. I'd like to point out as well, EN classification is not shorthand. Okay, so sometimes the E's and the I's and the W's and the R's get used for integrity, insulation, and radiation and load bearing as if they're shorthand. It's not. It's a classification system, and so we do see some people saying, well, we already have EN 16341 certification. There's no problem. We already have certification that can provide certification against EN 16341. This is about providing the framework for the classification system that aligns with the requirements of EN 13501-2 that allows the product performance characteristics to be communicated according to that standard. So that's what this is about. And by pulling inside and removing that 476 from approved document B, the building regulation guidance is about what's required to get the products inside the buildings. So it's not just about products that are covered by the CPR when it comes to the EN classification system. It applies to any of those construction products that fall within inside the building regulation guidance. So it applies to both products that are CPR and non-CPR. So in the world of Dorsets, we know we haven't yet got a product standard for internal Dorsets, but as they are inside the building regulation guidance, the EN classification system will now apply to those products as well in terms of that performance regime. So why certification? We certainly champion, we still see it, and it's still recognised as a system that offers the highest level of assurance when it comes to the performance of products. So this performance regime, we certainly want to make sure that we've got third-party certification schemes to cover it for those reasons. Third-party certification schemes, they allow suppliers and manufacturers to demonstrate to the market that their product has been attested to fulfill specified requirements, giving those confidence to the end users on the performance of that product. And we have started with QMark certification for EN classified Dorsets. Effectively, they are some of the first schemes to launch, but there are more schemes to come, both within the BM TRADA QMark space, but also across our other certification brands, including Certifier and CertiSecure. So whilst these are the first to launch, there is a lot of work going to accommodate other products, systems within our other certification schemes as well. And you'll hear more about that in due course. But today we're talking about the EN classified Dorsets under the QMark scheme. Okay, so on with the EN classification process. In a nutshell, it's actually relatively straightforward. You have your test standards, so the standards against which you evaluate the performance of the product in test conditions. You then move forward and you take that test evidence and extend the scope of it, and that's done under XAP standards or DIAP rules within test standards, but it's the process of extending the scope. And then you communicate the performance of the product depending on the performance characteristics that you want to communicate based on the test evidence by following the requirements of the relevant classification standard. And for fire resisting doors, that's within EN 13501 Part 2. So when we look in the classification standard itself, the classification standard, as I mentioned, that's relevant to Dorsets is 13501-2. And within the standard, it explains what is meant by integrity as it relates to the classification letter, which happens to be E for integrity, and breaks down what that means. But it also goes through the other performance characteristics that are relevant to the products covered by that 13501-2 standard relating to fire-resistant construction products. E for integrity, I for insulation, W for radiation, R for load bearing, and so on and so forth. Within there as well, so there's a number of sections that relate to different types of products, and the one that relates to Dorset's shutter assemblies and open bore windows is section 7.55, and that tells you the test methods, the field of application rules that you need to use when drawing together the evidence that would allow you to apply a classification to that particular construction product. It also gives information on how to present that classification in terms of the string of letters and numbers and what they mean, and we can explore that a little bit later. And then in the annex, it gives you a format as to a template as to what a classification report should contain, information on the sponsor, who prepared it, a description of the product in sufficient detail that someone can see that the classification report relates to the product that's in front of them, and a summary of the evidence that's been used to pull that classification report together. So, starting at the start, beginning on our journey in terms of how do we go about generating a classification, and it is about starting with a product family. This is a definition from 152691, and this breaks things down for a product family into three parts. So a product family, reading out the definition, is a group of products within defined limits of variability of the product parameters and is derived from at least one representative product that has been successfully tested. And you can think of this as the design, okay? The next part, the limits of variability are defined by the manufacturer or a technical specification and are determined by the allowable changes in terms of composition, materials and constructions given by the applicable EXAP rules or relevant supporting tests. And this is effectively the scope of the product family. And then finally, for all product family members, the fire resistance and or smoke control performance has to be equal or better than the lowest common classification that the manufacturer wishes to declare, and this is the performance. So in terms of conceptually, if you like, this definition of product family, think of it as the wish list. And I've taken the time just to break this down a little bit further and relate it to something that you would certainly be familiar with in terms of your the current products that you manufacture against the assessments that support those scopes within the national schemes. So if we start with design, when we're looking at product family, the first question really you want to be asking is, well, what is the product and how is it made? Okay, so breaking it down, what is the core? What is the leaf construction? What are the leaves made of? What facings do you apply to the door? What are the glue lines? What apertures do you want in the door? Do they come with aperture liners? How do you go about glazing the door? What door frame? Typically, how do you construct your door frame? What materials and so on? And the seals that you'll need to fit to the door based on the performance characteristics that you want to claim. Now, I appreciate when you look at this, you think, well, yeah, that's all well and good, but I want alternative facings, alternative glue lines. I want different numbers of apertures and shapes and door frames and seals and all the rest of it. That's fine, but that part's in the scope. Initially, you want to be thinking of this as your general description of construction. And that's a section that's within the field of applications that you'll be familiar with today. It's the description of the product in terms of what you construct, and then we can start digging into the next part, which is the scope of the options that you want to provide. So that's the first part. What is the product? What is the design of that product? Then we look at the scope, okay? And the scope is where you're starting to look at the design options, the options to the design that you make. So now you're looking at things like dimensions, okay? Not just smaller, bigger, but there will also be things in there in terms of size alteration. So do you need to provide for adjustment to lippings, for example, for on-site fitting? Or is the design of the door, has it got internal framework where to adjust the size of the door in part of the manufacturing process? You can, you're looking to have the option for reducing those, that framework or removing it altogether. Configurations, singles, doubles, but also things like over and side panels, fan lights, side lights, or solid infill panels. Also, what hardware you would like to fit to the door, options for hinges, lock sets, closers, access hardware, air transfer grills, whatever hardware you want to provide for that particular product design. Glass as well, type, number of apertures, alternatives in terms of glazing systems and shapes and so on. Facings and finishes, decorative finishes, and other faces you might want to offer to the door, and perhaps alternative seals. And there will be other things that are missing off this list where there'll be additional scope requirements as well. Now, the best way of thinking of this part, this is the bit where if you, those of you that have, well, all of you will be familiar with the field of applications, think of the sections within your current field of application. And indeed, that's how we've laid out our XAPs. It should feel familiar. So if you're looking at those different sections that currently handle the glass, the hardware, the facings, the finishes, and the seals, you can begin to understand, well, what is that scope? And clearly, the more scope that you want to offer, the bigger the test program will be. But that's the same situation as now. There are some things that we need to think about within the XAP framework to avoid, to make sure that an efficient amount of testing is conducted. And I'll explain that shortly. So scope, really, you've got an existing framework. You can almost tick things off if you look at the sections within your current field of application. Then we're looking at performance, okay? And this is a very important part of the defining the product family. And this is the performance that you need. So this is where we're looking at, do you need integrity? Do you need thermal insulation as well? Insulation performance? Do you need smoke control? We've got SA3 or SA4. Do you need radiation control? Do you need self-closing? And do you need durability of self-closing? Now, in the vast majority of cases, in terms of the performance characteristics and classifications we look for in the guidance to the building regulations, you're looking at fire and smoke. Sometimes there are requirements for insulation requirements, but typically most are called up as integrity and smoke control. But the classification system does cover the other characteristics that are on the screen, and we have brought them inside the third-party certification schemes for EN. So in this case, you've got to think end-use requirements. Now, why is this important? You could think, well, I'll go for full integrity, insulation, and smoke control, but unless you need to provide certain designs with full insulation, it's worth thinking, because that is going to start dictating the product family in terms of maintaining that insulation performance. So, for example, the glass will be of a particular specification in terms of being able to provide that full insulation that you may require. So it is worth thinking about those end-use requirements and what characteristics you definitely need from a particular range of products, rather than thinking, well, if I set out for the everything, then I can trim it back accordingly, because you may well end up with a specification of door that always requires fully insulated glass when it comes to glazed apertures. So all of the above, as I've said, have been included in the new QMark schemes. So thinking about that performance and how that's going to shape your product family going forwards is very important. So if we get under the and have a look at the test program considerations, we have EN 15725, and that's the header standard for XAPs. That doesn't tell you specific rules on XAPs. This is the governing document that tells you what goes into an XAP, what the approach to XAP is, and it also includes a section now on how to prepare XAP standards. So there are two approaches within EN 15725. All start with the definition of the product family in the way that I've described. So design, scope of that design, and what is that performance that you're setting out to achieve. Just to sort of reiterate on that performance piece, a number of characteristics under our national approach. For example, with insulation, it's been possible to get to that insulation performance by fitting a different piece of glass that can perform and marrying it with what you know of the Doorset performance also being an insulating core. Likewise with smoke, it's been possible to cascade previously tested smoke seals that have been tested to the relevant standard and claim smoke performance. It's not to say there's anything wrong with that system, but the way in which the European classification system works, it looks at all of these characteristics from a Doorset-led perspective. So it's not a case of just backfilling things based on evidence that's been generated on other designs. It looks at the design, at the characteristics, the performance characteristics you want from that design, and does it from a Doorset-led approach for those characteristics for that design. So you define the product family. You then establish the evidence required, and this is known sometimes as reverse engineering. It's something that we can do in the technical team of Warrington Fire. And you're looking at those end goal objectives and using the rules within the relevant XAP standard to work out a test program. You don't have to use us for the technical work. You could look to navigate the rules yourselves or use others for that. But there is an exercise there just to work out what evidence you'll need to generate to meet those end goal objectives using those rules. We then look to generate the evidence according to that program. So that's the fire testing and smoke testing and making sure that that's been done according to the performance characteristics that you're after. And then with those results, we then check whether they're going to cover that product family objective. Depending on the results, it might be a case of redefining that product family. So maybe it isn't a fully insulating set based on the performance of the glass, but that's okay. The product family now is integrity. Or we actually look to say, well, we need to get that. So it's a revising of the test program, and that may mean doing a retest with a different piece of glass, for example. Once you've got the family that you want, that you've either set out to achieve or it's been revised accordingly, that's when we can start preparing the scope documents, whether that's using DIAP rules from the test standards or the separate XAP standards. And then we can prepare a classification report, including that direct application scope, or we prepare a classification report and we reference that XAP. So we've now done the testing according to what we need to test to meet those objectives. We've used the XAP rules to extend that test evidence to meet those objectives based on that original program. And now we can write a classification report to confirm those performance characteristics using 135012. The little diagram on the right there, that's taken from EN 15725, and that shows you approach 1. Now, in all of this, remember that third-party certification schemes, all third-party certification schemes will have specific requirements according to supporting evidence. My colleague Nick Whitelock will talk to this later. So just cracking on and getting the evidence generated, you need to be mindful that if it's going into a third-party certification scheme, you need to check the requirements of the schemes before embarking on a test program. Otherwise, the test evidence may not meet those requirements, but we'll get into some more detail later on that. Approach 2, very similar, but this is recognizing that you still need a product family, but you may already have evidence. Okay, and that evidence would be submitted to the laboratory that's going to prepare the XAP and classification report for the product family that's being requested. And effectively, you're going straight in to check whether the results of and that evidence do in fact cover the manufacturer's product family. If it doesn't, in a similar way to what we described before, you either redefine the product family or you undertake further tests to fill those gaps that you need. Ultimately, when you're happy with the scope redefined or you filled the gap with additional testing, you prepare the scope documents and you prepare the classification report that includes the direct application, or you prepare a classification, you refer to the separate XAP that's been prepared. And again, no different. Remember that third-party certification schemes will have specific requirements, and we'll talk to that later. So I've done a slightly different arrangement for those of you that have seen me sort of explain the concept of product families and so on before. Others I know won't have, but I thought I'd use these slides against existing XAP rules to show you the importance of getting that scope right against the performance characteristics that you want to provide. Okay, so we have a fairly basic looking double door here. We have a product reference for it, and it's the EN door. And in this instance, the manufacturer, it's timber based. They want integrity and insulation for 60 minutes. And so we know that we're looking at the extended application rules within EN 15269 Part 3. The design, it's a particle board design. Could be anything, just pick that. It's lipped. It's got glazed aperture liners in it. It's glazed. It's in a softwood door frame, unlikely for 60 minutes to be fair. But it's got a timber door frame, 2mm timber veneer finish, and it has fire seals. It has intumescent seals around the perimeter. Obviously, there will be hardware in there and other features, but in it, its basic design, its general description is there. So what I've done, look at a very basic set of requirements. I know most scopes will run wider than this, but if we just start with dimensions, typically most people want the option of making things smaller than what was tested. And when we look at the EXAP rules within 152693, it points at the DIAP rules in EN 16341, that rule in the EXAP standards A31, and it permits you to make it smaller. Fine, tick. So that's the first scope requirement ticked off, and we can do that. Another requirement typically is that we'd quite like to make it larger, and there are specific rules within the EXAP standard that govern height increase, A32, width increase, A33, and limited by area as well, A34. So we know, based on testing this design, we've got the scope for making things smaller and larger. Okay. There was also a request for adding veneers and removing tested veneers. And actually, that is possible. There is a set of rules for that, A51 and A52. A request also for lipping thickness increase and decrease to provide different options for lipping thickness, but also quite often there's a requirement for some scope for site fitting allowance to just allow for some lipping adjustment. That is possible in fire, but there are limitations to the increase and decrease of lipping thickness, and that is given in A515. And an option to remove apertures. Okay, so having a door without any glazing in it, but also to reduce the number of apertures from 2 per leaf to 1 per leaf, or 2 in one leaf and none in the other. And there's a rule for that as well. Now, there are conditions around each of these rules, for example, so removing apertures, it would need to be that the glass tested is less than a certain percentage of the leaf size because of the stability that glass can offer to timber-based leaves. The same with the reduction in the number of apertures. But given what we've got in front of us, it's possible. Okay, so straight away, with a request for with some information on the design, the goal for performance characteristics, and with some requests for scope, we can work our way through the EXAP, and actually with one test, we can get these options covered off, pending a successful test. When things start getting interesting, and this is why you need to understand from the off if you're looking at fire only or fire and smoke, same design. This time, though, we're looking for integrity, insulation, and smoke control. The SA4 relating to ambient smoke control, where the door has been tested without a a tape at the bottom of the door. So it has some form of seal at the bottom of the door that allows it to provide the required level of ambient smoke control. So the design, there is the same design, but obviously now we are looking that there would be some smoke seals included, and there'll be a reason. I'll explain the reason for highlighting some bits. So same request, we want to make it smaller. It's the fire and smoke door. We still want to make it smaller. Now, looking in the EXAP rules within 1526920, you can make it smaller. And that aligns with the rules that allow you to make it smaller according to Part 3 for fire. So smaller, ticked. Starts getting interesting with larger now, because actually under 1526920, you can only make a leaf larger if you've tested the Doorset at 500mm high, and area is 6 meters squared in the case of a double door. Okay, there are specific rules around height, width, and area, but now we have a conflict between the fire scope and the scope. So if you were to test the fire door, for example, at 2200 high and test the same design smoke 2200 high, you would be limited at 2200 high or smaller. So straight away, if you're not balancing both XAP standards against that performance requirement, you may end up with something that limits a particular design scope option. Okay. Options for adding veneers and removing tested veneers is possible within 15.26920 as it is in part 3. And there is also the potential for adjusting lipping thickness, but the way in which the rule is handled, and the reason why you have different ways in which the rules are handled is because you're looking for different characteristics. It's limited to the sealing system on the smoke door, whereas it's a limited amount by plus or minus 25% of the tested thickness. So again, if you're not careful and make sure that you've got your required lipping thicknesses tested for fire, you can end up testing something that doesn't give you the lipping range that you actually want when it comes to fire and smoke. And apertures being removed and apertures being reduced is also fine from a smoke perspective. The reason why I've highlighted the smoke seals here is that you'll be looking to include smoke seals for the smoke testing, but if you haven't included them in the fire test, you can't add them for fire resistance. So straight away, you can see the importance of balancing both sets of rules within the fire and the smoke XAP to make sure that your scope objectives are balanced and you can achieve both. Yeah, and it's different to the way in which we've handled certain characteristics under our national system. So what does it look like? We have a door, we have a fire test, we have the first XAP, first classification report, and you get the classification that you want. You've got your family that you want, where you've only used 15.2693, and you've got your leaf size increase and decrease, alternative veneers and decorative facings, 0 to 4 apertures, and you've got your lipping thickness that can be altered. With smoke, you're now balancing a fire and smoke test, but you need to use those XAP standards in tandem to make sure that when it comes to the classification of these designs for EI260SA4, your family 2, is that you've got your leaf size increase, decrease, alternative veneers and apertures and lipping thickness, but you needed to make sure that you've done the right leaf height for the smoke test, that you've made sure that you've checked the lipping thickness of lines in both, and that you made sure that your smoke seals were included in the fire test. So I've done different versions of these slides, and it's still something that's not widely understood, but hopefully that's another way of presenting the importance of families against the performance classifications that you need at the end. Okay, so how does this get presented? You can then start seeing that the Doorset design, based on those family references for those particular performance characteristics and the evidence that supports that, and the XAP scope, you get your details of the classified product and families. And that design will be described in the classification report, as I've already mentioned, and there'll be a table in there that will identify the different families for that Doorset design based on scope and class, so you know what relates to what and what scope is given for those particular designs. The classification itself will contain this as a communication of the classification, and there is a statement that will now be included going forwards. This has been it's a request from UCAS that it's made very clear within the classification reports that the classification document does not represent type approval or certification of the product. The statement is in there to make clear what the classification is communicating. It's that codified common technical language that communicates the integrity, insulation and smoke control as appropriate, because quite often we're hearing classification reports being waved around as if they are certificates. They're not. They're the conclusion of a process that communicates the performance of the door according to those classes. Okay, so that's part 1 done in terms of EN classification, and hopefully just a bit more information and detail on how to break down those product families and relate them to the XAP rules. In summary, we are heading towards EN standards. Certainly England approved document B, with BS 476 being replaced by EN standards. There will be a requirement, we're already seeing it, to specify EN classification, and it'll be driven by those building regulation requirements in the guidance. So the EN classification system, particularly in relation to doors, has sort of historically, I think, primarily been bound up with the CPR. The fact that we've not had a product standard for internal door sets has meant that in many cases 476 has been the default standard. By bringing it into the building regulation requirements, irrespective of whether we have a product standard for it, it's that EN classification is going to be driven for all door types. EN classification is a defined process of testing, extension, and classification using the standards that I've talked about. So that's what we will look to bring inside the certification schemes, which I'll talk about shortly. And defining product families help classification process, but try and think of it more like a wish list and get some familiarity around some of the things that you already have undertaken in your existing scopes and field of applications over the years under our national system. So what about added assurance? So third-party certification, we know the background, okay, covered that off. In response to that proposed change within the guidance of approved document B, we have developed QMark schemes for the certification of door sets and updated existing ones to accommodate EN 135012. Okay, we've updated our systems house scheme, and we've introduced 3 new schemes for Doorset Manufacturing, 078, 088 and 098, covering metal, timber and composite door sets. Just to run through what we mean by systems houses. Systems house is a product designer who submits product for testing with the primary aim of making evidence available to others. So the testing product, but the aim behind doing that is so that they can cascade that evidence to others that then will actually manufacture the product for market. It's a very widely recognised route for supplying construction products to market, not just construction products, but that's what we're talking about. It's also known as a simplified route. That's the term that is actually called up in the CPR, but a simplified route for manufacturers to construct and supply products, because the evaluation in terms of the test evidence that support the product sits with the systems house. The systems house is responsible for maintaining the technical information they cascade, but the compliance of the product with the supporting evidence is the responsibility of the manufacturer. So you can see there the front cover of one of the TI sheets. Why have a systems house scheme? Well, it is something we've had for a while. We've updated it to accommodate 135012. It provides added assurance to manufacturers and end users that the cascaded technical information is correctly documented and controlled. That's brought inside the scheme. It gives confidence to manufacturers the product is capable of the stated performance. A system that's cascaded under a certification approach, because it's cascaded to multiple manufacturers, those manufacturers will be undertaking audit tests, which is a continual multiple feedback loop into that system. And any of that feedback then can get accommodated as necessary. So those feedback loops give confidence in the product's consistent performance and identify any potential reduced performance from that expected, as opposed to just relying on evidence outside of that third-party approach, just relying on evidence that's been cascaded. Well, further benefits, technical information and support to the manufacturer, in addition to the cascaded supporting evidence. So it's not just about the technical documentation, but there's also supporting technical manuals that give more practical information on how the things are to be constructed. The scheme itself does give access to QMark certified manufacturers that can add cascaded supporting evidence to their scope of certification, whether that's both under national or EN. Like I say, this has been updated to accommodate EN. It does actually deal with both. And for those manufacturers that only rely on systems houses, it gives, because we have pre-certification audit test requirements, all manufacturers that are relying on systems houses or in the QMark scheme, they would have done some testing to support the fact that they can actually make something, successfully make something with the performance that's required. So some of the responsibilities under the systems houses, they'll need to identify which companies have had which system cascaded to them. So the management of who's had what, with permissions to use each system and with an established agreement between the parties, between the systems house and the manufacturer. Involvement with pre-certification and audit test processes that are required under the QMark scheme for manufacturers. There will be a responsibility to manage updates, amendments, suspensions, or withdrawals of the system from QMark certification, which is a requirement of anybody under a third-party certification scheme. There will be a requirement to support, as I've just mentioned, a technical manual alongside the supporting evidence, the test reports, classification reports, and XAPs. And they'll need to also have ongoing audits to demonstrate compliance with the scheme requirements. There'll be an expectation of training and technical assistance to QMark certified manufacturers in a sufficient level of detail that imparts knowledge on their specific system and how it's to be turned into a fire resisting door, if there's any specific characteristics or machining requirements for their particular design. There's an expected feedback loop of any reduced performance, whether that's done by an audit test or whether it's testing that's been undertaken elsewhere. And there will obviously be a supply of supporting evidence to the QMark certified manufacturer. In this case, the DIAPs, the XAPs, and associated classification reports with all supporting evidence, including test evidence and sampling reports. So what is a Doorset manufacturer? So we've got a supply of complete product in this case. Manufacturing door sets using their own evidence or can use cascaded evidence from a systems house, and they're supplied with certain design and performance attributes to meet specification requirements. The performance of the door set is based on supporting evidence. And for EN classification, this will be EN test standards, DIAP, XAP, and classification. So the benefits of a door set manufacturing scheme, the added assurance to the end users that it's effectively and consistently manufactured in accordance with that relevant supporting documentation, giving confidence to end users that it's capable of the intended performance classification, the feedback loops as well, giving that confidence in the consistent performance and to identify any potential reduced performance from that expected, but also the traceability of the fire door sets through labels indicating the certified company's unique identification number. Specific responsibilities for door set manufacturers. There'll be an identification of the designs to be included. Satellite factory functions as well. So do they use other organizations, other manufacturers for specific components or processing? Understanding the scheme requirements related to sampling, audit testing, and test evidence. Effectively managing updates, amendments, and suspensions. Maintaining technical manuals with the storage, handling, and FBC requirements, having QMark audits to demonstrate compliance, maintain and provide installation instructions, providing feedback to BM TRADA, very similar a set of responsibilities to the systems houses, and then applying the required labels to the door set indicating the performance supporting evidence, allowing that traceability back to the certificate. So the application process. So in summary, we understand the systems house scheme, the Doorset scheme, the importance and the roles and responsibilities that they play. What is the process for joining the scheme? First of all, there's a determination of a requirement to join this manufacturer scheme. So you'll be looking at the materials, whether a timber, metal or composite, and then an application to join the relevant scheme, depending on what you manufacture. And there's the application form and an application to join the QMark Doorset manufacturer scheme goes in. I'll talk through this process and mention where systems houses feature as we go along the way. There is a separate application process for systems houses. I'm going to walk through Dorsets and just show how the systems house links. We then get onto the evidence for the purpose of certification. Okay, so obviously underpinning the certification is the evidence, and we've talked about the EN classification system, but the evidence would be there if it was under the national system as well, as everyone on the call knows. So do you have evidence? If you don't, then there'll be a job of collating that evidence for review by BM TRADA, and that collation could be your own evidence or it could be evidence cascaded by systems houses. If it is system house evidence that you're relying on, then effectively, if it's under the QMark systems house scheme, that evidence would be effectively pre-ratified as being acceptable and can move forwards. If it's your own evidence that you already have, it would need to be reviewed. Or if you don't have any evidence, then you need to generate some, and that will be conducting an appropriate test program. And we've walked through what's required there with the EN classification system. Ultimately, that review will determine that the evidence meets the scheme requirements. And it's at this point, if it doesn't, you would need to go back through and conduct further testing. So it's very important as part of generating the evidence is understanding what the scheme requirements are. And it's at this point, I will hand you over to my colleague, Nick Whitelock, to talk through the acceptable forms of evidence under our certification schemes. Nick, if you want to take it from here, thank you.
Good morning, just about, and thank you, Peter. My name's Nicholas Whitelock. I go by Nick, Technical Manager of Doors and Smoke Control. So I'm going to be exploring the criteria for supporting evidence with you. Much of this is going to sound very familiar. And firstly, we're going to jump straight into sampling. So if I could have the next slide, please, Peter. Thank you very much. So sampling, as many of us will know, provides evidence of what the product was originally tested. So in most cases, it will get the information of what the test specimen is prior to the actual test being undertaken. And in some cases, it's virtually impossible to tell what that information is at the time of the test being undertaken. It offers additional reassurance to the ongoing production as things move on from the original test. This information can then be audited and verified against the original testing. And for all of our schemes, all sampling reports must follow the principles of the group and notified bodies papers, any relevant rules or checklists, and they must be in English. So you'll note that there are multiple schemes that have been talked about today. They will have relevant checklists for each of them. Sampling for our schemes must also be undertaken by an approved representative of BM TRADA. We may accept sampling from other bodies. However, this would be subject to approval. We'd need to know who's undertaken it, the quality of the sampling report. Is it in English? Does it capture enough information for us to verify what was originally tested and whether it's representative against the test evidence? All test evidence must have been sampled to meet the criteria of our scheme. So we are expecting all ITT to be sampled prior to the testing being undertaken. And pre-certification or audit testing must be sampled by a representative of BM TRADA. That does bring us on to the testing itself. So initial type testing. So initial type testing demonstrates the performance of the product. It's a common term to use to describe test reports generally. Each certified performance characteristics needs test evidence in order to be able to be certified subsequently. For our schemes, evidence must be from a lab meeting the following requirements. So the laboratories generating the test evidence must be accredited to 17025, and the test method must be on the schedule of accreditation. Laboratories must demonstrate independence, and this can be one or all of the following ways. That can be approved body status, notified body status, or membership of eGolf, which is the European group of organisations for fire testing, inspection and certification, albeit a bit of a mouthful to say. We do expect eGolf position papers, agreements and recommendations to be followed for all European testing, in the same way that if we were looking at British standard of testing, we would expect the fire test study group resolutions to be followed. In all ITT must be written in English, and if it's not written in English, we are able to accept it providing it's been legally notarized as in its translation. We do reserve the right, and in all instances, not to accept test evidence that meets these criteria. And that's mainly due to if there would be any doubt in the results given, if there were discrepancies within the report, or alternatively, the credibility of a laboratory or area or some doubt over the test. Following a test, it's fairly common within the European system to get a direct field of application. And a direct field of application provides an extension to scope from what's been tested. It's based on the rules given within a particular standard, typically within clause 13 of these European test standards. And for some products, for example, doors, it's stated in the door standard that the classification should be defined within the classification report. The scope and any boundaries of a direct field of applications need to be clearly communicated. It can't be an ongoing end of scope that can be interpreted in multiple ways. A declaration is required from the manufacturer that none of the product's design, or where we go back to what Peter mentioned earlier about the glues and things, has changed since the original testing has taken place. Although it's not a requirement for the European framework, Warrington Fire and Element certification bodies and assessing bodies will be looking to the PFPF guide, Annex D, to do a review for suitability of all test evidence prior to its use. At least one piece of test evidence must have met the intended performance criteria to be classified. So this going back to the lowest common performance that was mentioned earlier, it needs to be primary test evidence and not supporting. Historic evidence can indeed be used, however, it will be subject to a review against the relevant group of notified bodies guidance on the use of historic evidence. That historic evidence may well be test evidence generated to an earlier version of a test standard. Where the test evidence is not owned by the customer that's applying for a direct field of application or extended field of application, we do require written permission for the use. Extended applications, that would be a more extensive extension to the scope of the tested products. It can be based on a single test report, but is typically based on more than a single test report to maximize the scope available. This document is not able to include any form of expert judgment, and it is, as Peter mentioned earlier, based on EXAP standards itself. These standards contain prescriptive rules, and the complexities were explored a little bit earlier. 15725 also states that the EXAP should be undertaken by an organisation that's accredited to undertake at least one of the tests, 17025. And they must have undertaken at least one of those tests as well. Test reports have been, EXAP reports, that have been prepared by the laboratories may be accepted within our schemes. However, they will be subject to a full review. All of the associated evidence, including any test evidence and sampling, will need to be reviewed by a representative of Warrington Fire to verify that the scope is actually supported by the test evidence and meets the requirements of the scheme. All EXAP reports relevant to the product's classification shall be clearly referenced in the classification report when in concluding to a classification report to ensure that that's tied all the way through, making sure that that product family gets the correct designation. Similarly to direct field of applications, all test evidence will be subject to the review. So the test evidence to generate that EXAP will be subject to the review in accordance with Annex D of the PFPF guide. At least one piece of sample test evidence needs to have met the performance classified. EXAPs do allow for the identification or isolation of failures if the particular items can be completely removed from a product family. So it's typically something that will be common in those areas, but again, emphasizes the importance of these reviews to make sure that the scope ties in. Historic evidence, again, can be used, but review would be required, and making sure that nothing's changed drastically that would change the result within the conclusion of the EXAP. And then where the test evidence isn't the property of the customer that's applying for the extended field of application, we will also require written permission. Finally, we'll look at the classification report side of things, and a classification report, as we've explored already, confirms the classified performance assigned to a product. It will either contain a full direct field of application scope or alternatively reference one or maybe even multiple extended field of applications, depending on where and what is being classified. Classification reports will be written in accordance with 13501, depending on the performance that they're looking to achieve, depends on which part that would be. So reaction to fire being part 1, fire resistance, which we're likely going to be more familiar with here would be fire resistance in part 2. Then all test evidence and test reports and XAPs relevant to the product's classification needs to be referenced in there. When prepared on the basis of the DIAP, we've got that defined scope, which was required for the direct field of application side of things. And then more detailed information on our requirements for what's required for each of our schemes will be in those technical information sheets referenced earlier. And I'll now hand you back to Peter to continue the certification journey through. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick. That's also that all of this information is backed up in one of our TI sheets, which we said we'll make available at the end. So without further ado, we'll get into the next part of the certification process. A critical part of that process is the contract review, where the application process must capture the requirements of the applicant in terms of their name, legal entity. It's then reviewed by the cert body to confirm that the certification scheme that they've applied for is available, sufficient resources available, and then we can look at contractual arrangements between the client and the cert body, including the scheme requirements, prices and checks that the client is prepared for certification. At this point, we're gathering all the necessary documentation to establish the extent of what is to be certified in order to determine the scope of certification. And this may involve additional pre-certification testing, for example, if it's for a new application where a manufacturer isn't already part of QMark. And also it'd be a review linked to the previous slide on supporting evidence as well. Just on pre-certification and audit testing, there is an FAQ that we are produced, as I've mentioned, and that will be released alongside any additional Qs that we get as a result of this presentation, and that will clarify the requirements around any pre-certification or audit testing with those of you that are already within the existing national QMark schemes. So on that contract review process, you've then got the initial factory production control, looking at evaluating the company for its compliance with the scheme requirements by audit and subsequent evaluation. The FPC looks at the items you can see on the screen there, confirming validity of design specifications, confirmation of ITT, pre-cert tests, documented procedures, purchase and delivery records, documented requirements for FPC, critical storage and conditioning, marking and traceability, and so on. And that list isn't exhaustive. Based on the information gathered there, it then allows the certification decision process, where the results of that evaluation are reviewed. And actually, to maintain the integrity, that is performed by persons that are not involved with that evaluation process. At that point, pending the decision, a draft certificate can be sent to the client, and on confirmation of those details, a certificate is issued with its status made publicly available online, and the certified company can start making the products. So certification being awarded, confirming that the performance of the product has been established by ongoing audit testing and FPC, and providing confidence to the end users that the designs should be capable of the indicated performance. And in the case of the evidence that's been brought inside these schemes, that will be in terms of performance classification using EN 13501 Part 2. So that's taken you through the process of application and some of the things to expect along the certification journey, including an overview of the supporting evidence and requirements that sit within our scheme. Just a very quick run through the certification process as an ongoing process. So you've got the definition of the certified product, the scope of the product, which we've covered, the sampling of that product as a part of the certification process, the testing that takes place, and the evidence that's prepared. And for those that rely on a systems house, that activity, if you like, is done by the systems houses. For those of you that generate your own evidence, that would be something you'd be responsible for. We've just looked at the aspects of factory production control, and then following that with the certificate issue that allows the manufacturers to make the products. We also, within certification, it's an ongoing process. So we have a feedback loop of validation and verification, and that's done by ongoing FPC surveillance, factory production control, periodic audit testing, including sampling under the manufacturing schemes. That then allows the ongoing marking and labeling of a product as a certified product. And within the certification process, we'll also be looking to make sure that we maintain our schemes in line with any changes in response to regulatory requirements, or the manufacturer will also have an obligation to inform of any changes that may affect their certification as well, whether that's a change in manufacturing processes and so on and so forth. So, as a summary, we've walked through our the EN classification process. We've had a look at supporting evidence. We've looked at the two schemes, Systems House and Doorset Manufacturer, and the process of how we practically go about applying and joining the schemes. Just very quickly to conclude, some additional information that we've taken from our FAQs, and just to read through them. A question on what system will be used to identify EN classified Dorsets. The new scheme will use printed labels and QR codes for Doorset identification for communicating performance. The manufacturer and the supporting reports with a link to the supporting certificate. The reason for doing this is to future-proof of digital records and to take account of golden thread requirements. Questions on the existing QMark schemes. So, for example, under door blanks, it will still remain a requirement for door blanks to be certified to be used with QMark certified door sets for both the existing national and our new EN schemes. And the existing QMark certification schemes will remain operational to provide solutions for both national and European classification applications. The new schemes allow the early adoption for Doorset manufacturers. What about those that don't do door sets, door leaves, door frames and door assemblies, which are covered under the existing 006 scheme? I mentioned at the beginning, the scopes of the schemes will be clarified going forwards. We are looking at solutions for them to manufacture under the EN classification system, but we've handled door sets initially, and we will clarify what those schemes will entail. But the bottom line is, when it comes to EN classification, that it's still EN evidence that will be underpinning those schemes going forwards. And finally, the certifier schemes as well. Work is underway on revising and preparing new certification schemes for EN classification of construction products, including door sets. Like I say, we've started with QMark, but there are going to be more. And with all our new and revised certification schemes, these developments will be supported by technical information and opportunities for discussion and questions through product sector-led panels. Is the Systems House scheme just for EN classification? No. I mentioned that it does cover both EN classification and national application. We've just revised it to accommodate both. And to let you know that there will be additional FAQs that will be made available covering, for example, the interaction with UKCA and CE marking, audit testing, and the interaction with other schemes. And I've mentioned the technical information sheets on the Doorset and Systems Houses and requirements for supporting evidence, and that will be made available on our website. Thank you for listening. Thank you, Nick, as well, for your presentation on supporting evidence. Also, thank you to Andy Sumner for the information and support on the certification scheme requirements. So that's me. Thanks once again, and we'll see you soon.